In the pre-dawn hours of January 18th, 1978, on the adjoining military installations of Fort Dix Army Base and McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey, an encounter occurred that would forever change the lives of those involved. What began as a routine night patrol escalated into what some believe is one of the most compelling cases of direct contact between military personnel and an extraterrestrial being on American soil. This is the story of the Fort Dix incident, a case that remains classified, denied and buried under decades of secrecy. The winter night of January 18th, 1978, between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m, was cold and still at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. Air Force Security Police Sergeant Jeffrey Morse was conducting his routine patrol of the base perimeter. With years of family tradition in police service, Morse took his duties seriously, diligently monitoring the quiet installation while most personnel slept. The silence of his shift was suddenly interrupted when reports began coming in over his radio. Unusual aerial objects had been spotted over the neighbouring Fort Dix Army Base. The objects were moving in tight formation, displaying bluish-green lights that cut through the darkness. What seemed at first to be an isolated sighting quickly escalated when radar operators at both installations confirmed the presence of these unidentified objects. "We had visual confirmation from multiple points on base," Morse would later recall. "The objects moved with precision like nothing I'd ever seen before." As Morse continued his patrol, he noticed increased activity. New Jersey State Police vehicles and Fort Dix Military Police were running code, emergency lights and sirens activated in the direction of Brownsville, New Jersey. The unusual coordination between civilian and military law enforcement at this hour suggested something significant was underway. At approximately 3:30 a.m, Morse received orders to proceed to Gate 5, located at the rear of McGuire Air Force Base. A New Jersey state trooper had arrived requesting emergency access to the base, specifically to the runway area that connected with a heavily wooded section of the Fort Dix training grounds. Upon meeting the trooper, Morse learned the astonishing details of what had transpired minutes earlier. The trooper explained that a Fort Dix military policeman had been pursuing a low-flying object that had hovered directly over his patrol car. The military police officer described the craft as oval-shaped with no distinguishable features, emitting an eerie bluish-green glow. During the encounter, the officer's radio transmission had suddenly cut off. What happened next would change everything. According to the trooper, a being had appeared in front of the military policeman's vehicle. A creature approximately 4 feet tall, with greyish-brown skin, a disproportionately large head, long arms and slender body. The military police officer, confronted with this unearthly figure, reacted in panic. He drew his .45 caliber sidearm and fired 5 rounds into the being, then fired 1 additional round at the hovering object above. The MP panicked, Morse later reported, recounting what the state trooper had told him. He fired 5 rounds from his .45 caliber into the thing and 1 round into the object above. Immediately after the shooting, the hovering craft ascended at remarkable speed, joining what appeared to be 11 other similar objects high in the night sky. The being, wounded but mobile, fled into the wooded area toward the fence line separating Fort Dix from McGuire Air Force Base. With orders to assist in locating the wounded entity, Morse permitted the state trooper to enter the base. By this time, Multiple security patrols had converged on the area. The search didn't take long. Near one of McGuire's abandoned runways, runway 5, they found it. The being had apparently scaled the fence between the bases before succumbing to its injuries. Morse and the other security personnel observed the body from a distance of 40 to 70 feet, illuminated by the headlights of their patrol vehicles. Though not close enough to discern facial features or detailed anatomy of its hands and feet, Morse could see that the entity was unlike any creature he had ever laid eyes on. It was about 4 feet tall, Morse described. It had a fat head, long arms and a slender body. The skin was hairless, wet-looking and shiny, almost snake-like in appearance. It was greyish-brown in colour. Particularly notable was a strong, pungent odour emanating from the vicinity of the body. There was a bad stench coming from it, Morse recalled, like ammonia, but it wasn't constant in the air. When later questioned about whether the body might have been that of a wild animal or an escaped research specimen, Morse was definitive. No zoo nearby. We did have a problem with deer on the runway, but no one ever made such a big fuss over a deer. Following standard protocol for what appeared to be a crime scene, Morse and his colleagues cordoned off the area with rope. However, what happened next deviated dramatically from standard operating procedure. Within minutes of securing the perimeter around the body, a team of unfamiliar personnel descended upon the scene. Dressed in fatigues without patches or insignia and wearing blue berets, they quickly took control of the situation. All personnel, including Morse and other regular security police, were ordered to stay outside the established perimeter. They took over, Morse said. When asked who they were, we were told nothing and ordered to stay outside the ropes. He noted that all of the mysterious team members were staff sergeants or higher in rank, yet they wore no identifying markings on their uniforms. Their blue berets were identical to those worn by McGuire Security Police, suggesting they may have been a specialised unit stationed on base, which would explain their rapid response. Under the glow of portable generators brought in to illuminate the scene, Morse observed the team spray the body with an unknown substance from a portable tank. They then covered the entity with a white sheet. Before daybreak, the team carefully placed the body onto a platform and constructed a wooden frame around it. This was subsequently placed into a large square silver metal container, approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, with unidentifiable blue markings. Access to the immediate area was severely restricted. Morse noted that the only base commander, the Security Police Squadron Commander, First Lieutenant W.S. of the Security Police Squadron, and a base photographer were permitted inside the cordon. As dawn approached, a C-141 cargo aircraft arrived from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, identifiable by its distinctive markings. Using a forklift, the containment box holding the entity was loaded onto the aircraft. Morse, still on duty, watched from a distance as the plane took off at approximately 7 a.m, carrying its extraordinary cargo to what he presumed was Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, long rumoured in UFO circles to be a repository for extraterrestrial materials and bodies. For Morse and the others involved, the incident at McGuire was far from over. The machinery of secrecy was already in motion. 2 days after the incident, Morse received orders to report to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was not alone. 3 other personnel who had been present during the discovery of the body were also summoned. They were transported together on another C-141 aircraft. Upon arrival at Wright-Patterson, Morse and his colleagues were separated for individual interrogations. The setting was austere and intimidating, resembling a court-martial proceeding more than a debriefing. Morse found himself seated in a sparse room with a table and chairs facing multiple interrogators. Mine had 2 men, Morse recounted, one apparently a civilian with a pipe and beard who never spoke. At one point there were 3 men. One played nice guy, one mean guy, and of course the silent civilian. The questioning focused exclusively on what Morse had witnessed and what information he possessed about the incident. At no point did any of the interrogators provide explanations or directly reference the nature of what had been retrieved from McGuire Air Force Base. All they wanted to know was the nature of the incident, what I knew, and then they told me about my duty to keep my mouth shut, Morse stated. I signed a form and it is supposed to bind me for life. He noted the cryptic nature of the questioning. They beat around the bush. All references to it were indirect. The day after the interrogation, Morse returned to McGuire Air Force Base, where he was debriefed by his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel F.M., and released for normal duty. As if by unspoken agreement, the incident was never again discussed by anyone at the base, as though it had never happened. Shortly thereafter, each of the airmen who had been involved in the incident received transfer orders to separate overseas bases. Morse was reassigned to Okinawa, Japan, effectively scattering the witnesses across the globe. For 2 years, Sergeant Morse maintained his silence about the events at Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base. However, in September 1980, while still stationed overseas, he made the decision to document what he had witnessed. Using official military letterhead, he wrote to UFO researcher Leonard Stringfield, providing a detailed account of the incident. Morse's decision to break his silence was not without consequence. In subsequent communications with Stringfield and fellow researcher Richard Hall, he reported incidents of surveillance and harassment. His mail was often intercepted, phone calls monitored, and on multiple occasions, government vehicles were observed near his residence. Despite these pressures, Morse persisted in sharing his story, even providing a copy of an incident complaint report, Form 1569, related to the events of January 18, 1978. This document, though marked unfounded, which Morse explained referred only to the limited information available to the Security Police Squadron, contained names of personnel involved and corroborated elements of his account. In the years that followed, Morse's credibility was repeatedly assessed by researchers who met with him face to face. Richard Hall, who interviewed Morse in January 1985, found him to be amiable, articulate, and consistent. Hall noted that Morse did not exhibit behaviours typical of someone fabricating a story. He showed no obsession with the incident, had limited knowledge of UFO literature, and expressed a willingness to be investigated. Most telling was Morse's lack of embellishment. When asked about details he couldn't recall or hadn't observed directly, he simply acknowledged the limits of his knowledge rather than filling in gaps with speculation. While Morse's testimony stood as the primary account of the Fort Dix incident, a second witness eventually emerged to provide partial corroboration. George Filer, a former Air Force major who had served as an intelligence officer at McGuire Air Force Base in 1978, came forward with his own recollections. Though not on duty during the early morning hours of January 18th, Filer arrived at the base later that morning and immediately noticed unusual activity. Our security police went out there and found him at the end of the runway, dead, Filer stated in a later interview. They asked me to brief the general staff, but I was later told not to. Filer's background lent credibility to his statements. As an intelligence officer, whose duties included briefing the commanding general, he would have been positioned to learn about significant incidents on base. Additionally, Filer had his own history with UFO encounters, having previously chased an unidentified craft while flying for the US Air Force over England. I personally have observed a UFO both visually and on radar, Filer noted. I've been chasing them ever since. The convergence of these two independent witnesses, Morse with his direct observations and Filer with his peripheral involvement, strengthened the case that something truly extraordinary had occurred at Fort Dix and McGuire Air Force Base in January 1978. For Jeffrey Morse, the consequences of his involvement in the Fort Dix incident extended far beyond his military career. After his discharge from the Air Force, he faced ongoing challenges directly attributable to his decision to speak out. As a direct consequence of innocently being in the wrong place at the wrong time, noted researcher Richard Hall, Morse has been harassed and threatened, and his reputation defamed to the point that he had difficulty finding employment in the law enforcement field. In October 1986, Morse experienced a disturbing incident while visiting his family in California. He was detained under obscure pretenses by local authorities. Outraged, he filed a lawsuit against the California-based authority, but his legal inquiries were repeatedly stalled by bureaucratic obstacles. The source of the pick-up and hold order remained unidentified, raising suspicions of continued surveillance and harassment. Despite these pressures, Morse maintained his willingness to discuss the incident with trusted researchers. In January 1987, he met with Stringfield, Hall, Dr. Bruce Maccabee, chairman of the Fund for UFO Research, and William Hall, electronics engineer and brother of Richard, at a shopping mall in the Washington, D.C. area. Though he remained incognito, using only his first name, he spoke freely and responded to detailed questioning about the incident. This meeting served as further confirmation that Jeffrey Morse was not a fictional creation, but a real individual with a consistent story that had remained unchanged through years of scrutiny. The Fort Dix incident of January 18, 1978, stands as one of the most compelling cases in UFO literature. Not for the aerial phenomena observed that night, but for the alleged direct contact between military personnel and a non-human entity that resulted in fatal consequences. What sets this case apart is the detailed testimony of a credible military witness who maintained his account across decades despite personal and professional costs. The partial corroboration provided by Major George Filer adds another layer of substantiation to the narrative. If the events occurred as described by Sergeant Morse, they represent a profound moment in human history. The documented lethal encounter between a human being and an extraterrestrial visitor on American soil. The Fort Dix case raises disturbing questions about government transparency, the existence of specialised units dedicated to containing evidence of extraterrestrial contact, and the sophisticated apparatus dedicated to concealing such incidents from public knowledge. For Jeffrey Morse, the burden of that January night in 1978 continued long after the body of the strange visitor was flown away. His career trajectory, personal security, and professional reputation all became casualties of his unwitting involvement in what may be the most closely guarded secret of our time, that we are not alone. What began as an ordinary night patrol evolved into an encounter that permanently altered the course of his life, buried beneath layers of military classification, institutional silence, and bureaucratic obstruction that continued to obscure what our governments conceal from public view.